Hi, everyone. In this week's lecture, I'm going to focus on the context of the European witch hunts with a series of videos. This first one is going to focus on the ecological, historical, and religious contexts for the witch hunts. So first, let's talk about what medieval Europe looked like so we can understand where different ideas might have come from in relation to their political and ecological situation. The Roman Empire falls in the 5th century, and with that goes pretty much like every good idea that Europe ever had, because we fall into what is known as the Dark Ages, and holy shit was it dark. The vast majority of Europe's population were like poor peasants that had shitty tools and basically tilled the earth in the mud until a plague or a band of bandits killed them and burned down their village. People are living in really abject conditions, and then you have the kings in these stone castles that rule over all of their feudal lords, and then the feudal lords rule over all the peasants, and the peasants live in mud and dirt and crap. Like, this is why it's called the Dark Ages. Almost nobody could read. Like, only like a few monks in monasteries can read. There's no dissemination of information. People pretty much live very provincial little lives in their own little village and do not understand anything else that's going on in the world. There are mobs of roving bands of people who are attacking random villages. Like, there's disorder and death. People die all the time. Like, it is a terrible time to live. The Dark Ages are ass. That's why we call them the Dark Ages. So people living during this time live in terrible conditions, don't know anything. You can kind of see where this is going to be going, right? We also call these the Middle Ages because they're in between the Roman Empire, which was hella cool, and the Italian Renaissance, which was also hella cool. They were right in the middle of that, and they were the shitty period in the middle. That's what the European Dark Ages are. Perfect to like breed ideas of witchcraft. And dropped right in the middle of this, you have a period where like lots and lots of feudal lords get upset because their peasants are having lots of kids, they're expanding their families, they're demanding some rights. This is starting to create some social tensions. So a bunch of lords go to the Pope, are like, hey, you need to help us get rid of extra peasants, and you need to help us get rid of like our competing feudal lords. So the Pope says, why don't we send everyone to the Holy Land to fuck up the Muslims and free Jerusalem? That's called the Crusades. The Crusades are literally when middle-aged Europe has too many people, and so the Pope decides to send as many poor people off to their deaths as possible by sending them off to the Holy Land and saying, look, man, Jesus wants you to go do this. What ends up happening? A whole bunch of dudes go and fight the Crusades, and a whole bunch of women are left, because that's like literally what happens every time there's a war. So now you have lots and lots of women. Everybody in the community does not trust the church because, like, I really liked my neighbor and he went off and did what the church said, and now he's dead. So there starts to be mistrust of the Catholic Church. At the same time, you have communities in upheaval because normally, according to their social order, everything is supposed to be run by men, but all the men just went off and died in the Crusades. All of their social systems start falling apart. So as you can see, we're moving into more and more of kind of the triggers that we connect with witches, right? Distrust of the church, concerns about holiness, death and disease everywhere, women without their authority figures around. Like, we're seeing kind of the breeding points where witchcraft accusations are going to come up. Of course, in the 14th century, you have the Black Death. And the Black Death is the bubonic plague. The bubonic plague still exists today, but we can treat it. So don't worry, we're not all going to get the Black Death. But back then, they had absolutely no idea what the Black Death was, what the bubonic plague was, or how to treat it, or how to deal with it. And so it wiped out anywhere between 30 and 60% of the people of Europe. 60% get wiped out in less than 10 years. Like, rich people, poor people, old people, young people, like, it didn't matter. It just like wiped through. Like, people would go and try to like run to the countryside and like hide in country states, and they still would get infected with the plague and they would end up dying. And the interesting thing is the Middle East's death rates were much, much lower than Europe's death rates. And why? Because in the Middle East, where they practiced Islam, cats were kind of like Muhammad's like cool buddy, wingman. Cats eat rats. Rats spread the plague. So, lo and behold, places with lots of cats did well with the plague. But in Europe, where cats were considered friends of the devil, cats are often killed, which is why you see such high amounts of the plague. This is part of the reason that cats are often associated with witches, because women that kept cats had fewer rats and less disease, and so somehow that seemed mystical and magical. But in addition to the Black Death killing a shit ton of people, it also made everyone afraid of everything. And if you don't seem to understand that, think about the fear culture that's developing in the US while we're in the middle of a pandemic and our death rates are not nearly as high. If you were living during a period where at any point, like your entire family could just die over the course of a week, you would be terrified of breathing. Oh, by the way, breathing helps prevent the Black Plague. You'd be afraid of water. Oh, wait, because town water's being poisoned, spread the Black Plague. Like, you'd be afraid of eating food. You'd be afraid of everything. So it creates a culture of terror throughout Europe. The Reformation is an incredibly important point in Christian history to understand, and a lot of people don't study the Reformation in their history classes, so I want to be sure you're familiar with it. But the Catholic Church had existed for over a millennia, and there were lots of people in Europe who were very dissatisfied with the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church had really become decadent. They were selling indulgences, which is basically where rich people could buy a piece of paper that said they automatically got into heaven no matter what shitty things they did, which, like, man, am I glad we don't sell indulgences now. And the Catholic Church had become really decadent in the sense that the papacy had a lot of power, but also a lot of wealth. A lot of the churches that were built were like ridiculous. Like, I've been to tons of churches around Europe that were built before the 1500s, and they are incredibly ornate, and they are over decorated, and they are ostentatious. So there was a lot of feeling towards the end of the Middle Ages that the Catholic Church really didn't care about people. And it definitely didn't care about God. It only cared about wealth. Martin Luther was a priest in Germany, and he gets uber frustrated, nails 95 Theses on the wall, recasts himself as one of the greatest religious philosophers of his time, possibly of history. And he starts the Reformation. And he actually calls for the Catholic Church to reform itself. But what ends up happening is that a lot of people go, you know what? The Catholic Church isn't going to reform. It sucks. Let's start our own churches. And this begins the Protestant movement. And so that's why we have Protestant churches, Anglican churches, Lutheran churches, Baptist, Episcopalian, Presbyterian, Protestant churches. They were protesting the Catholic Church. So this period begins a reformation where we reform Christianity because the Catholic Church failed to reform itself. We see a whole pop-up of new religious organizations and new religious beliefs that are alternatives to the Catholic Church. So the Catholic Church obviously thought this was a bad idea, and so they have the Counter-Reformation. This includes the Council of Trent. All the top Catholic religious leaders from around Europe get together and decide how to rewrite some of their rules. They get rid of indulgences. They ask the Pope to keep it down a little bit. They push a lot of new Catherine doctrine designed to really focus on religiosity and driving out sin. And so this is going to include things like witch hunts. The Counter-Reformation kind of comes to a head along with the Reformation itself, and you see one of the first big Catholic versus Protestant wars, which is the 30 Years' War. And of course, the 30 Years' War means death, destruction, and chaos throughout Europe, and that's why 1618 to 1648, you start seeing a lot of Europeans who are religious, especially Protestants, fleeing to the New World. So this is when we're going to start talking about America. The colonies, which would eventually become the United States, are made up of Protestants fleeing the Counter-Reformation and fleeing the war and conflict that comes from the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation in Europe. We also have the Little Ice Age. So starting in the 1560s, now this is right in the throes of the Protestant Revolution. So we already have social upheaval. We already have political upheaval. It's barely been 200 years since the Black Plague, and society's barely getting itself together by the fact that, they already lost half of them. So they're finally getting their shit together. And in 1560, we see the beginning of the last Little Ice Age. And why is this a top period for witch hunts in Europe? Bad weather means bad crops, means people dying from famine, social tension. Witches are often associated with weather. If you think about witchcraft in American society, the way that we depict it in films and how it is often associated with lightning and thunder and wind and weird wonky weather like tornadoes. Weather magic is often associated with witches in Europe and elsewhere. And part of it is because when you have things like these ice ages, people can't explain them. And you're not going to blame God for them, because if you say anything negative about God, you might go to hell, and that would be way worse. So you got to blame somebody. Your entire life, your crops grew fine, and then for the past 5 years, it has been so cold that you can't grow any food and your children are starving to death. You've got to blame somebody for that. So witches become the scapegoats for misunderstanding of meteorological phenomena. Whew. Okay, guys, that was a big one. Let's wrap it all up. Thank you so much for listening to this background on witches. And please go back and make sure you understand the Levant text. We're going to be talking about it more in section this week. Thanks so much for your time.